What's up, guys? This is Indiana, or Indy. He is our new BPS Customs mascot. You may have seen him in my overclocking video very briefly. He is our new French Bulldog puppy, and he might be appearing in videos from time to time, although he's not going to be jumping up on the table quite as much as the cats would. But he's adorable. I just wanted to give him some FaceTime with you guys. Indiana. There are plenty of PC tutorials on YouTube. I mean, that's kind of what this entire channel is based on. If you're a new builder, there is definitely no shortage of resources out there to help you physically assemble your new system. However, that's not all there is to learn if you're a first timer. And I wanted to address some common issues that I get asked about constantly that aren't necessarily related to how do I install a graphics card. So with that being said, these are beginner mistakes that you might be making and how to avoid them. Ready to dive into custom water cooling but unclear about what parts you might need? Check out Thermaltake's new M360 Plus RGB kit. Featuring a D5 pump res combo, 16mm hard tube, Pacific C Pro fittings, and the best RGB implementation on the market, the M360 Plus fits all mainstream Intel and AMD sockets and is fully expandable as your system evolves. Check out the link in the video description to learn more. Let's just jump right into it with beginner mistake number one, and that's something that I try to emphasize when I do my monthly builds. Unless you have some grand plan that involves imminent upgrades or changes, you should try your best to balance your hardware. Keeping like parts with like parts will reduce the chance that you're shortchanging yourself on performance somewhere in the chain. While it may be tempting to start your build with a $700 or $800 GPU and just fill in the rest with the remainder of your budget like this Ryzen 3, this could lead to serious bottlenecking if all you have the money for is a dual-core Pentium and 8 gigs of RAM. It's not entirely helpful to think in terms of percentages because as you move towards higher-end builds, things can skew heavily depending on what the main use of the system will be. However, for non-HEDT systems, you typically want to spend a little less than twice as much on your GPU as you do on your CPU. This will lead to configurations like an i5 with a 70 series GPU like a 1070 or 2070, or a Ryzen 7 CPU with an 80 series card. The new 9900K would pair fantastically with a 2080 or 2080 Ti. If you have something like an AMD 2200G, aim at a graphics card like a GTX 1050 or a 1050 Ti. Along the same lines, don't pair an Intel K-SKU CPU with a motherboard that isn't overclocking capable. At that point, you're just throwing money away on the more expensive processor without the ability to take advantage of what it can do. You also don't want to splurge on something like a $300 ROG motherboard if you just have an i3. There are more reasonable choices that will allow you to allocate more funds towards memory, storage, and the rest of your build that otherwise would just be tied up in a motherboard. Keeping with this theme, we can jump right into mistake number two, which is motherboard size versus case size. I see a lot of submissions for Show Me Your Rig with enormous cases and teeny tiny motherboards. I've also seen a lesser amount of the opposite, with way too much hardware crammed into a tiny space. When you're planning a build, generally micro ATX motherboards are cheaper than full ATX boards, so it might be tempting to buy one and save a few dollars. Now, there's nothing at all wrong with that, but this is why micro ATX cases exist. The main problem here becomes aesthetics, as you'll have to run all of your cabling from grommets specifically spaced for large boards across what is now empty space to plug in where they need to go. Stay consistent with your sizing if at all possible, and everything will look neater in the end. Continuing with our planning type mistakes, I often see builds or parts lists with power supplies that are way overkill for the systems they are powering. Again, if an upgrade is imminent, this is probably fine, and a power supply operating well below its max rated wattage will actually be more efficient as long as you're utilizing somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 to 60%. But if your new build is only drawing, say, 300 watts and you muscle up with a 1500 watt power supply, or even something like an 850 watt power supply. Not only are you just way overspending initially, but your unit won't be operating at anything near peak efficiency. PC Part Picker has a handy power supply calculator where you can input all of your components and it will tell you what your power draw should be. Of course, you don't want to just get by with the minimum, because even at stock clocks, a CPU and GPU can draw additional wattage as they boost. However, I'd say 90% of configurations out there can get by with a 600 or a 650 watt power supply at most. And there are some really good ones out there that are fully modular, 80 plus gold rated, and under $100 from reputable companies like EVGA, Cooler Master, and Seasonic. If you're targeting a budget build, 500 or 550 watts will probably do you just fine, and these are even cheaper. I cringe whenever I see a really well thought out budget system rocking a $200 750 watt platinum power supply. It's just not needed. And it's money that could have gone towards other components that actually contribute to performance. Number 4, you've decided on your components. You've placed your order. You've assembled everything in your case. But what the hell, the RGB lighting on your fans isn't lighting up. I released a video last year on the Masterbox Light 5 RGB, a budget enclosure that comes with 3 RGB fans up front. By far the most popular comment on that video is either, "I can't get the fans to light up," or "the fans won't change colors." Most RGB fans require some measure of control in order to operate correctly. This means either a remote control, a 3 or 4 pin RGB header connection like this one that goes into your motherboard, or a separate controller box. Know before you buy. If your motherboard is older and doesn't have an RGB header on it, most new ones do, then you'll need to find a different way to control your lighting. Otherwise, your fans will just look like this. If your fans come with a controller box and you have literally no space to put it in for some reason, your fans will either be stuck on rainbow puke or they might not light up at all. RGB lighting is a great addition to the PC building arsenal. It lets us make each system unique without having to worry about color matching all of our components. But there is a small opportunity cost to using them, and you need to know what that cost is ahead of time and invest and plan accordingly. While we're on the topic of plugging things in wrong, number 5 is something that I surprisingly see even experienced builders do from time to time, but is a definite beginner mistake that causes some serious performance degradation. Your graphics card has video outputs on the part that faces outside of your case. This is where you need to plug in your DisplayPort or HDMI cable if you want to use your GPU for displaying images and such. Many Intel and some AMD motherboards also have display outputs on the rear I/O, and yes, this can certainly be confusing because this is where you plug in the rest of your stuff, right? All the USB and networking cables go right here, so why would the display out be different? Well, it is. And if you bypass your graphics card's ports, don't be surprised when Fortnite is running at 12 FPS. It's a simple fix, but I've even sold graphics cards before to people who I thought were experienced, and then they told me that the GPU was broken because they had their system plugged up wrong. Don't be that person. The last thing I want to touch on today that I see beginners do is being afraid to overclock. Overclocking sounds kind of sketchy. You're taking a perfectly functional part, pumping more power through it, and making it run faster than it's supposed to. In the 90s and early 2000s, there was some real danger in trying to squeeze out those last few megahertz from your processor, as few if any safeguards existed that might prevent you from cooking your chip. But modern hardware is honestly very difficult to damage in this way. The enemy of overclocking is heat, and CPUs and motherboards are now built to automatically shut down if too much heat is detected. They also won't boot at all if you're just putting too much voltage through the socket. Similarly, GPU overclocking has been made infinitely easier through software like EVGA's Precision X1 and MSI's Afterburner, which have really simple interfaces and allow you to adjust things with sliders. Similar to CPUs, you can't really overvolt a GPU. If you dial in too aggressive of a setting, the system will protect itself and eventually reboot with stock frequencies. If you're afraid of overclocking, you're literally leaving money on the table by paying for performance you will never use. Even if we're talking as little as a few percentage points, if you bought a component that's capable of overclocking and don't at least try, you're doing yourself and your system a disservice. Yes, it's true that running a heavy 24/7 overclock can lead to degradation in the long run, but again, this is mainly due to heat. So you don't have to go overboard, but overclocking sometimes can even let you ride out a generation of hardware longer than you would have otherwise. Strap a decent cooler to your motherboard, give your GPU some good airflow, and see what your system can really do. So those are 6 kind of offbeat beginner mistakes that I see being repeated over and over again. What are some things that you've done that maybe you're not so proud of? Let me know down below in the comments. Also, don't forget to get subscribed to the channel if you're not already. Check out the merchandise store where you could pick up cool shirts like this, linked in the description. And as always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.